Science is supposed to make life better. It builds vaccines, cures disease, and helps us understand the world. But what happens when that same science is twisted into something monstrous? Throughout history, behind closed doors and government files, some of the world's most respected scientists have done the unthinkable. They broke boundaries, they shattered ethics, and in the name of discovery, they unleashed unspeakable suffering on real people. These aren't science fiction horrors, they are real, and they all began with one question: what if we could? But no one stopped to ask, what if we shouldn't? These are 7 disturbing scientific experiments that went horribly wrong, and once you hear them, you'll never look at science the same way again. Number 1. Nazi medical experiments. It began with a terrifying idea. What if you could erase a bloodline without a single drop of blood? To build their so-called master race, the Nazis sought not to just kill, but to silently wipe entire generations from existence. And that meant finding a way to sterilize people without surgery. Painless, invisible, efficient. At the heart of this horror stood Dr. Horst Schumann, a man whose white coat masked something far more sinister. Inside Block 30 of Auschwitz, he conducted some of the most grotesque experiments in Nazi history. His weapon of choice? X-ray radiation. Prisoners were told they were getting medical exams. Instead, they were stripped, lined up like cattle and blasted with concentrated radiation directly to their reproductive organs. The pain was instant. Skin blistered and peeled. Victims screamed as burns spread through their bodies, some collapsing on the cold concrete floors. Many weren't told what was happening, only that it hurt like hell. Women became infertile. Men's genitals swelled, split, and in many cases, rotted. Some survivors could no longer walk. Others developed deadly infections. But to Schumann, the suffering was just data. When the radiation didn't produce quick, clean results, he tried removing ovaries and testicles by hand without anesthesia, often using crude tools. There were no clean incisions, no recovery, just silence and death. Worse still, those who survived the procedures were often killed anyway, executed or gassed to clear space for new test subjects. And when the war ended, Schumann vanished. He escaped to Africa, living under a false name in Sudan, then Ghana. For decades, he walked free while the victims of his failed sterilization project lived on with broken bodies and no justice. He was finally found and arrested in 1966, but he was declared unfit for trial due to illness. He died peacefully in Germany in 1983. But the victims, their pain didn't end, because this wasn't medicine, it was genocide, disguised in the language of science. Number 2. Japan's Unit 731. It was never about victory. It was never about playing God with disease. In the quiet outskirts of Harbin, China, there existed a facility so secret it didn't even have a name, just a number. Unit 731. Run by the Japanese Imperial Army, its mission was horrifyingly clear: turn biology into a weapon. Inside, doctors and scientists, once healers, became executioners in lab coats. Civilians, prisoners of war, and even children were used as test subjects. They were infected with deadly viruses, dissected alive without anesthesia, and used in pressure chambers until their lungs exploded. But the most devastating experiment was yet to come. Unit 731 wanted to create plague bombs, ceramic shells filled with fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacteria behind the Black Death. The plan was simple: drop the bombs over Chinese cities, let the fleas escape, and watch the outbreak weaken the enemy from within. But what happened next was far worse than they imagined. The plague didn't follow orders. The fleas swarmed beyond the drop zones, spreading across farmlands into remote villages and even back to Japanese military camps. The disease didn't care who was friend or foe. It just killed. Thousands began to die, first with high fevers, then swollen lymph nodes, then bloody coughs that didn't stop. Victims collapsed in the streets, their bodies covered in black boils, their organs shutting down within days. Entire towns were quarantined or burned to the ground. And through it all, the scientists of Unit 731 took notes. They called it research. They called it progress. But what they created was a biological nightmare they could never contain. In the end, the experiment backfired catastrophically. The plague spread beyond their control, becoming one of the most horrifying bioattacks in history. After the war, many members of Unit 731 were never punished. In exchange for their research, the US granted several immunity. Justice was traded for data, but the ghosts of their victims still linger. Not just in the ruined villages of China, but in every corner of science, where ethics are ignored in the name of progress. Number 3. The Soviet Poison Lab. Hidden inside the Soviet Union's secret police headquarters was Laboratory 1, later called the Camera, a top-secret poison lab born in 1921. Its mission? Create poisons that were undetectable, silent, and instant. To test them, Soviet scientists turned to human subjects, prisoners from the gulags, stripped of identity and hope. These victims were fed poisons, mixed into food or drinks, told it was medicine. But it was never about healing. Cyanide made people gasp for breath, their bodies twitching violently before collapsing. Mustard gas burned their insides, leaving them coughing up blood. Ricin caused slow, excruciating death, vomiting, organ failure, and paralysis that crept up like frost. And then there was C2, the Soviets' favorite, tasteless, odorless, and deadly within minutes. Victims would suddenly go pale, lose consciousness, and die peacefully. Too peacefully, like they'd just fallen asleep. Running the show was Grigory Myronovsky, a cold, calculated doctor who personally administered many of the poisons. He tracked every reaction: heartbeat, breathing, facial contortions. Some test subjects begged for mercy. Others screamed as their skin blistered or their bodies convulsed. All were expendable. Top Soviet officials, including Stalin, were well aware of the lab. They didn't just approve it, they demanded results. This wasn't medicine. It wasn't even war. It was pure scientific cruelty, disguised in white lab coats, behind locked doors, and buried under classified files. Number 4. Guatemala Syphilis Study. In the late 1940s, the US Public Health Service launched a disturbing medical experiment in Guatemala. Their aim? To test how syphilis spread and how effective treatments like penicillin really were. But they didn't ask for volunteers. Instead, they deliberately infected over 1,500 people, including prisoners, mental hospital patients, soldiers, and even children, without their knowledge or consent. The first phase involved forcing contact between infected sex workers and healthy men. When that failed, researchers escalated. Syphilis bacteria were injected directly into victims. Others had their skin sliced open and the infected fluid was rubbed into the wounds. Some were forced to breathe in contaminated air or had the bacteria inserted into their eyes or genitals. The goal was infection, not care. The effects were horrific. Victims developed painful sores, rashes, fever, and neurological damage. Some went blind. Others slowly lost their minds as the bacteria spread to the brain. The suffering was ignored. Treatment was inconsistent, and many received no cure at all. They were simply left to rot, bodies ravaged, dignity erased. All of this was kept top secret, buried in reports and classified files. The victims never knew why they were dying. They were just numbers on a medical chart, tools in a brutal experiment, pretending to be science. It would take over 60 years for the truth to surface, but by then, most of the victims were long gone. This wasn't medicine. It was a hidden atrocity, committed in the name of research. Number 5. The Stanford Prison Experiment. It started with a simple newspaper ad in 1971. College students were promised easy money to participate in a study on prison life. What they didn't know was that they were walking into a psychological nightmare. 24 students were selected. Randomly, they were split. Half became guards, the other half prisoners. The guards were handed military-style uniforms, batons, and mirrored sunglasses. The prisoners were stripped, searched, assigned numbers instead of names, and forced into shapeless smocks. Within hours, identities began to dissolve. At first, it was just play, but soon, the guards turned brutal. They barked orders, enforced punishments, and humiliated prisoners, forcing them to clean toilets with bare hands, do endless push-ups, and stand naked for hours. Sleep was stolen, food was withheld, and isolation became a weapon. The prisoners began to crack. Some sobbed uncontrollably. Others stared blankly at walls, unresponsive. One student had a psychotic breakdown and had to be removed. Even the man in charge, Dr. Philip Zimbardo, lost sight of reality. He let it go on, observing like a detached god. The line between roleplay and real cruelty had vanished. It took an outsider, his girlfriend, to call it what it was: abuse. Only then, on day 6 of a planned 2-week study, did Zimbardo shut it down. What did it prove? That, when given unchecked power, ordinary people can descend into sadism. The guards weren't monsters when they walked in, but by the time they left, something inside them had changed forever. Number 6. The Monster Study. In 1939, psychologist Wendell Johnson wanted to prove that stuttering wasn't inherited, it was taught. To test his theory, he didn't turn to adults or volunteers, he turned to children. Vulnerable, voiceless children. 22 orphans at an Iowa orphanage were selected for what should have been a speech study. But this wasn't therapy, it was psychological warfare. Under Johnson's direction, graduate student Mary Tudor split the children into 2 groups. One group received praise and support. They were told their voices were clear and strong. The second group, they were torn apart. These kids, many of whom spoke perfectly, were told they had speech problems. They were mocked, corrected, and shamed every time they opened their mouths. "You're starting to stutter," the adults warned. "Don't speak unless you're sure your words will come out right." Every sentence became a test, every word a trap. The results were devastating. Some children developed anxiety so severe that they stopped speaking altogether. Others, once fluent, began to stutter. The damage went beyond their voices. It sank into their self-worth. Some carried their new speech disorders and trauma for life. No medical help was given. No apologies were offered. The experiment proved nothing about the nature of stuttering, but it revealed how easily words could be used as weapons. It would be years before the world learned what had happened in that quiet orphanage. By then, the scars had already set in. This wasn't science. This was emotional mutilation. Number 7. Project MK Ultra. In the shadowy years of the Cold War, the CIA feared one thing above all: that communists had developed a way to control the human mind. To fight back, they launched Project MK Ultra, a secret program that aimed to discover a chemical weapon for the brain. The method, LSD, dosed to unsuspecting people like lab rats. One victim was Frank Olson, a respected CIA scientist. In 1953, Olson attended a retreat with colleagues. There, without his knowledge, his drink was laced with LSD. At first, no one said a word. Days later, Frank began to unravel. He became paranoid, convinced he was being followed. He spoke of quitting, of secrets he no longer wanted to keep. Then came the fall. 9 days after being dosed, Frank plunged from the 13th floor of a New York hotel. The CIA called it suicide. No questions asked. But his family never believed it. In 1994, his body was exhumed. The autopsy revealed skull injuries that couldn't have come from the fall. It looked more like a beating, more like a murder. The government issued an apology. They paid hush money, but the truth still buried. The horrifying reality of MKUltra is this: no one was safe. The CIA didn't care about consent or morality or the minds they destroyed. They simply wanted control. And Frank Olson was just one of the many victims lost in their twisted experiments. His mind shattered long before his body hit the ground. These experiments were not just tests. They were calculated acts of cruelty that left scars deeper than the bodies they ravaged. The scientists who carried them out believed they could control the unthinkable, but what they unleashed was something far worse. What remains isn't just history. It's a chilling reminder of how far humanity can go when darkness clouds reason. And in the silence, the echoes of their suffering still whisper, waiting